Thank you for coming out. My name's Howie Hawkins. I'm the Green Party candidate for governor of New York, and I'm here relaunching our campaign post-primary. And it's been frustrating for us because the Nixon-Cuomo debate was missing a lot of issues that we think are important and we have a different perspective on. And so one of the things we're calling for is let's have real debates in the last 6 weeks of the campaign. I'm calling for 4 debates, 4 different places: New York, Capital District, Central New York, Western New York, each on a topic so we can really get into the details and the voters know what their options are. We should cover the economy. Another one should be government reform. Another one, climate and the environment. Another one on the social issues, from housing and healthcare and education to criminal justice and civil rights. And I'm also here to say to that 500,000 voters that voted for Cynthia Nixon or Jumaane Williams or Zephyr Teachout that we're your plan B in the general election for progressives. And also tell those progressives who think Cuomo's their progressive, who is a progressive. The public opinion polls across tabs said most liberals were voting for Cuomo. No, we're your alternative. Take a look at what we're talking about. And I think the way I would summarize my program, I've been calling for a Green New Deal for New York. And this involves, we're standing in front of a statue of Martin Luther King Jr., who did a poor people's campaign in 1968 calling for an economic bill of rights. And this is something that's been on the public agenda since the last State of the Union address by Franklin Roosevelt, who said we need a second Bill of Rights, an economic Bill of Rights. Every person in this country, every person in this state should have the right to a job that pays a living wage. And if they can't work, an income above poverty. They should have a decent home, comprehensive health care, and a good education. And the Democrats have had majorities in both houses of Congress with a president, every president from Truman to Obama. And we've had the same thing here in New York. And none of these rights have been fulfilled. So that's what our program is about. And I'm not going to go into the details of each of those rights. You could ask me questions about that or look at our program. But we also call it a Green New Deal because we face a climate crisis. This is an existential crisis for our civilization. The climate science says industrial states like New York should go to 100% clean energy by 2030 if we're going to have 50% chance of avoiding runaway global warming and a total climate catastrophe that affects food production and creates billions, literally billions, of environmental refugees. And unfortunately, in the debate in the Democratic primary, the best we got offered was something called the Climate and Community Protection Act, which has passed the Assembly 3 times. And that was what Cynthia Nixon was urging Cuomo to adopt. The irony is, and I don't think Nixon even knew this, it codifies Cuomo's energy policy, which is terrible. We have only 4% wind and solar right now. They've undermined community solar with this VDER way of valuing, instead of net metering, what the community solar gets paid by the utility, the grid. You look into the bill, it says we should go to 450 parts per million to avoid catastrophic climate change. That's 15 years out of date for the science. It's right there in the bill. That's why Bill McKibben and others formed 350.org. Our bill, it's called Off Fossil Fuels, New York Off Fossil Fuels. It's a demand 100% clean energy and zero emissions by 2030. I ran on it in 2010. I ran on it in 2014. We got the fracking ban, and now we got legislation. And what I'm urging the climate action movement and everybody to focus on is this bill, just like we focused on the fracking demand between 2010 and 2014 and won it. I got 5% of the vote last time out. And I think Governor Cuomo looked at our 200,000 votes, about the same number as Zephyr Teachout got in the primary, and said, what were they talking about? Because he thought he had those votes. He couldn't take us for granted. And then we got the fracking ban, we got paid family leave, we got movement toward a $15 minimum wage and tuition-free public colleges, some criminal justice reforms, backing off on the high-stakes testing to evaluate teachers. We made a move, and this time we want to make a move more. Our slogan is demand more. We want more reforms, and more than that, we want system change. Because if we keep going the way we're going, we're not going to have a planet we can hand on to our children where they can thrive. They're going to be struggling for existence. So with that, I will save your answers to specific policies to your questions. But I want to introduce my running mate for comptroller, the state comptroller, Mark Dunley. Mark Dunley ran an anti-poverty organization for 30 years, the Hunger Action Network of New York State. He was on the Fiscal Policy Institute board for years. He knows more about fiscal policy than DiNapoli knew when he was appointed out of the Assembly. And Mark is calling, and he's the only candidate for comptroller, calling for the state pension fund to divest from fossil fuels as one of the steps we need to take to deal with this climate emergency. So Mark, it's yours.
Thank you, Howie. I mean, most people, when they think about the state controller, what does the state controller do? The state controller basically handles the money for the state, and there's a lot of issues I'd like to deal with that. I think the state controller needs to be a better advocate for fiscal fairness, that they need to stand up and say, why is the governor continuing to pass a state budget every year that fails to adequately fund the schools despite court orders? Believe it or not, I'm really against corruption. As a law student, I actually wrote the law that's been passed in New York State to give taxpayers the right to sue for legal expenditure, taxpayers fund. The first time the state legislature gave themselves a pay raise after they were elected in a lame duck session. I was working for Ralph Nader at that point, and I sued them to stop that pay raise. I lost. Court of Appeals had their own pay raise in that same bill, and they seemed to like the bill, for some reason. And I was on my town board in Poston Hill for a number of years, very rural Republican county, got elected on some environmental and fiscal issues. And one way to save money, I stood up and said, let's just put out every single contract that the town has for bid, see if we can get a cheaper price. Long story, suddenly everybody's screaming, and it turns out the chair of the county Democratic Party was the unnamed co-insurer of the town insurance contract. Never heard of that before, but basically meant he got to pocket half the profits. So he went and spent 2 years in federal prison because of that one. And of course, just yesterday, Governor Cuomo's top aide was sent to 6 years in prison for the corruption involved in the CPV power plant, which we believe that permit should be stopped. And also, the governor's other top aide was convicted of rigging the bid for the Buffalo Billion, $750 million contract. What people may not know is literally right before the governor put that process in place, he got the state legislature to strip the state controller of the power to oversee these type of contracts. We need a controller who's going to stand up to the governor, stand up to the state legislator, and that's why green is important. But we're here today along the river, partly to really focus on the climate change issue. Howie's really laid out that concern. I mean, we had the New York Times magazine last month devote their entire edition to the proposition that the planet is doomed, that we have waited too long to deal with climate change. It is happening much faster than we anticipated, especially at the polls, where you expect climate change to take first, and that our political system is incapable of responding to this dire threat. And so, in fact, we're now going to begin to talk about things like the extinction of human beings, but certainly within this century, the very real possibility that civilization as we know it will end. This is the New York Times, a pretty mainstream magazine, putting that out. We need to act. Howie has lined out, what we need to do 100% by 2030. What I've been doing for the last 5 years, I quit my job at Hunger Action Network with no other job lined up because I knew we were losing the fight on climate change. And even though poverty is very critical, and we haven't solved poverty either, climate change was so desperate, I felt I should try to take my particular organizing skills and devote it. I became very active at 350.org. One of the things we started 5 years ago was to try to get as many institutions as possible to divest their funds from fossil fuel companies, just like we did with apartheid 30, 40 years ago. Same organizing strategy. Incredibly to us, since we started the campaign 5 years ago, we've convinced 1,000 institutions worldwide to divest $6.2 trillion, far more than we ever expected. New York City recently voted to divest, which I helped organize that campaign. I've not been able to get New York State to divest. New York City is the third largest pension fund in America. The second largest is New York State. We have $6 billion invested in Exxon and Chevron and other fossil fuel companies. We literally have the Attorney General investigating Exxon and these other companies for lying to the world for 30 years about the reality of climate change, and we have the state controller putting $6 billion into Exxon. He has refused to meet with us over the last 5 years. If they had divested when we initially asked them to 5 years ago, the state pension fund would have an extra $13 billion. So we started this campaign because we felt it was morally wrong for New York State to put our dollars into companies that were destroying life on the planet. But it's also wrong to put money in an industry which is losing money and is going to lose a lot more value as time goes on. The world has said we're putting an end to the fossil fuel era, whether that'll be 10 years, 15 years, 30 years. But if your business is being put out by the world leaders, which is what happened in Paris, why would you possibly continue to put state money, state pension funds into the fossil fuel industry, other than the fact that they give huge amounts of campaign contributions to politicians? I want my son and hopefully my grandchildren to have a future on this planet. We need action on climate change. The New York Times says the planet is doomed. To us, a solution is to vote for the Green Party because we have the political will to do an emergency mobilization around climate. The other parties do not. And at this point, we'd be happy to take any questions.
You talking about the algae blooms?
Can
Well,
you
first,
incorporate the question into your answer?
sure. The question was, what do we plan to do about the toxic algae blooms? First of all, we got to stop the nutrients coming in, which mainly come from chemical fertilizers and also sewage outflows into the lakes. Well, that's the fuel. And I need to say also that we're getting more blooms because we're heating up, and that creates a climate in which we have these blooms. So this is a climate change issue as well. That means we have a whole program to transition to regenerative organic agriculture that doesn't use chemical fertilizers nor pesticides, rebuilds the soil, which will sequester carbon. If we're going to get below 350 parts per million carbon, we're at 410 now. So we not only have to stop putting it out, we got to bring it back into the biosphere, which means reforesting in some places. Here it means rebuilding the soil. Because when you do the chemical agriculture, the chemical agriculture, you kill the soil. So that it's a whole ecosystem that carbon would be fixed in those organic, the living organisms. And organic farms don't have the runoff that these chemicalized farms do. So, and then on a sewage side, this gets to the question of why doesn't the state pay for its unfunded mandates? They don't give enough money to the communities to do the proper sewage treatment. The state comptroller says we need to raise $80 billion over the next 20 years just to fix the roads, bridges, sewers, and sewage water treatment systems and the water system. So that brings up the issue of we've got to get rid of this tax cap, which is a slogan. It hasn't lowered property taxes. Have the state pay for its unfunded mandates, and also share the revenues like it used to. In the 70s, it shared 8% of state revenues. Now it's down to 0.4% of state revenues, and Cuomo has it frozen. So cities like Binghamton, my city of Syracuse, we can't afford to do the basic things, including proper sewage treatment. So that's stopping the nutrients. Now that some of these lakes are going to have the algae blooms, we're going to have to start filtrating the water. I'm from Syracuse. We get our water from lakes, Skaneateles Lake. We have not had algae blooms until last summer and this summer. And that means, and that stuff is toxic. So we're going to probably have to buy a filtration. Again, the state should provide the funds for that through the progressive income tax, keeping the stock transfer tax instead of giving it back to Wall Street. It's $13 to $16 billion. We got a windfall going to the corporations from the Trump corporate tax cuts. If they don't use that to raise wages or hire new workers, the state should take that. If the feds won't use those taxes, we can put them to good use. Right there, I just laid out, along with a multi-million-dollar brackets for the multi-millionaires, that's right there, $35 billion more that could be put into the infrastructure and remediating problems like the algae blooms. And since I brought up the tax issue, I just want to point out that the top 1% in the state got 12% of all income in 1980. Today they get 31%. That's 90,000 taxpayers who get $375 billion last year. That's $4.5 million each. If we raise their taxes 10%, $450,000 each, they would whine, no doubt, they would still be super rich, and we'd have $45 billion more that we can put into our infrastructure. And that's the best way to redevelop our economy, because public services and infrastructure are the public avenues on which private commerce thrives. So it's a long answer to a short question.
Howie, Connecticut, New Jersey, millionaires, the top 1%, are moving out of those states. What makes you think that the millionaires, the billionaires, will stay in New York State if you raise taxes on them?
Because they're making their millions here.
Incorporate the question.
Oh, the question was, if we raise taxes on the millionaires, why won't they leave the state? And the answer is, they don't. We have 2 peer-reviewed studies.
Tom Golisano left. He ran for governor.
Tom Golisano's running around New York State whining about his taxes still. He wants the property taxes lowered. He's got to pay income taxes on the money he makes here. He's the owner of Paychecks. They make a lot of money in New York State. When you fill out your state income taxes, upstate, they ask you if you made money in Yonkers or New York City, and if you did, you owe taxes. The millionaires will still pay taxes here if they still want to make money in New York.
Not if they move, though, Howard.
Okay.
Wait. Let me finish answering the question. We have 2 peer-reviewed studies. One's from 2009. New Jersey has double the rate of Pennsylvania at the top bracket. The millionaires didn't move across the border to Bucks County. They didn't move because
David Tepper moved to Florida.
You're talking anecdotal. I'm talking about peer-reviewed studies.
Okay. We can have a debate afterwards.
Yeah, let me just also say...
wait a minute, my friend. I was the first Green Party candidate and the only Green Party candidate for Binghamton City Council. There's never been a Green Party candidate.
Right. But this is a press conference.
I'm just asking questions. He brought it up.
Okay. We'd like to allow the media first, and we'll come back to that.
He can't face me. How can he face Andrew
I
Cuomo in a
faced you,
debate?
and I answered your question. So I'll take the next question.
I'd like to hear more about CPV. What are the chances of it actually being shut down, and what concrete steps would you take to do that? And please incorporate that question.
The question is, what will we do about CPV, Competitive Power Ventures plant, and so what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to stop it?
And what are the chances of it actually?
What are the chances of stopping it? Okay, this is the plant in Orange County that will add 10% to our carbon footprint. And that bill I was talking about that Nixon was touting, and Cuomo, it basically codifies Cuomo's energy policy. That plant is allowed under that bill because they don't stop frack gas infrastructure. If they reach the goal in Cuomo's policy and in that bill of 50% electricity by 2030, that would cut the carbon footprint by 14%, because electricity is only 28% of our carbon footprint. You got to deal with buildings, transportation, and agriculture. So you take away 14% by 2030, you add back 10% if this plant goes forward. And it was permitted with corruption. That's the bribes that the former treasurer and finance director of the National Democratic Party, Peter Galbraith Kelly Jr., gave to Joe Prococo. So it's a corrupt plant. Now, how do we stop it? There's a air permit pending. And we already know from the test runs that the people in that community have been suffering respiratory illnesses. So they got a real issue with the air permits. The governor should make sure the DEC doesn't permit it, and then should figure out how to dismantle that plant, turn it back to the farmland it was originally. That's the Green Party position.
Mr. Hawkins.
Yes, sir.
There are many issues that anyone who would run for governor or is governor would have to address. One of those concerns would be the Second Amendment. Let me first ask you, are you familiar with the red flag legislations that are pending the Senate and the Assembly?
The red flag legislation?
Yes, sir. Are you familiar?
I'm not familiar with that.
Okay. Then let me ask you instead, what is your position in general on the Second Amendment in New York State?
Okay, the question is, what's my position in general on the Second Amendment? And I'm fine with the Heller decision, which says people have the right to handguns, shotguns, and rifles, but also says that local communities have the right to regulate gaining access, permitting, and use. And then, of course, the devil is in the details of how you regulate. And I'm pretty good with all the SAFE Act regulations. I think we still need to close all the loopholes to get access. I'd like to see a longer waiting period so crimes of passion aren't done when you grab a gun and go do what you're all mad about. So that's my general position.
Do you think that the general discord nationally, the discontent between the two major parties, do you think that really opens up the race for a third party to come through?
I think it does. The question is, people's dissatisfaction with the two major parties, does that open up the road to a third party? I think absolutely. I've been involved in movements since the anti-Vietnam War movement to where we started out as a tiny minority and ended up being a majority. Anti-Vietnam War movement, the movement against nuclear power, the anti-apartheid movement, the ban on fracking. That was the most surprising victory I've been involved in. And so the next breakthrough is a major party, third party, that represents the people instead of these two corporate funded parties. And we know from public opinion polling, a majority of people want to see that. The number of independents not enrolled in either of the major parties is growing to where I believe they surpassed both major parties. So all that augurs well for a third party. I don't know if we'll break through this election, but having been involved as a minority, struggling, and then suddenly breaking through, it happens in a step. And one of these years, it's going to happen. So I'm optimistic.
You know, there's also a lot of speculation that the Green Party will begin to win more elections as climate change begins to overwhelm all other issues. We're seeing that in Europe now, where in Sweden that has emerged as the second biggest issue in their country because they literally see the Arctic Circle is on fire over the last month. We'd rather win while there's still time to deal with climate change. You know, putting the Green Party in power once everything begins to collapse is going to be too late. So if you're thinking out there about getting that Green Party in, let's do it now, not later.
Mr. Hawkins, going on, I'll come back to the Second Amendment in a moment, but in terms of economics, we know that Governor Cuomo over the last 8 years, based on its economic policies, has driven out over 120,000 New Yorkers per year, currently at about 1.2 million. We've lost about 20,000 small businesses, and they've taken with them in total about 1.3 trillion in revenues. You've just mentioned that you wish to increase the taxes on some of the creators of business in New York State. Can you explain to me how do you expect that to help and fund the additional costs for the environmental changes you wish to enact?
Okay, the question is, a lot of people are leaving New York for economic reasons. And small businesses, how are they going to benefit if we raise taxes? I said we raise taxes on the rich. I want to cut taxes on the working class. For example, back in the 70s, when we had a more progressive tax structure, the bottom bracket on the first dollar you earn was 2%. Today it's 4%. So they've soaked the poor and gave tax breaks to the rich. The problem with Cuomo's economic program is it's trickle-down economics. Give tax breaks to the rich, especially those that donated to you. Give them contracts, give them regulatory favors, like permitting the competitive power ventures plan. And because that, top Democratic official wasn't sure he could get it, he bribed Percoco. And then over at the Buffalo Billion, there's only a couple firms that could have bid, and they wrote the contract, the bid, the RFP, so that only one firm would qualify. That was the bid rigging. I mean, this kind of nonsense goes on, and so we end up building a film lab in Syracuse out of the economic development funds that doesn't do any films, and they spent millions of dollars building it. Instead of, that's trickle-down economics, and it don't trickle down to us. If the rich get the money and they don't actually invest in anything, they're doing stock buybacks, they're doing mergers and acquisitions, or they're just buying financial assets. That doesn't create new wealth and new jobs. That just rearranges who owns who owns what we already got, and it tends to concentrate the wealth because the rich got more money than before. Now, the way we help the small business and the working class in this state is to lower the cost of living and doing business. So, single-payer health care will lower the cost we pay for health care. Property tax relief, I talked about that. Public power, public utilities, we have 50 of them at the municipal level in the state, provide power at much lower cost than IOUs, investor-owned utilities. On a nationwide level, it's an average of 13%. Broadband, the state is mad that Time Warner, the condition of the merger, and they called it now Spectrum with Charter, was that they'd build out the broadband infrastructure, and they didn't. So the Public Service Commission says, Charter, you should sell Spectrum to another company. We're saying have the state take it over and set up community broadband. Utilities that operate at cost for public benefit, not for the profit of absentee shareholders. We just had a study out earlier this year from Harvard that says the community broadband systems in the country provide better service at lower cost. So those are the ways we lower the cost of living here and doing business here for everybody. And then businesses will thrive, workers will be working, and people will stay.
Let me follow up. I'm sorry.
No, that's
If
a
I-
bottom-up approach.
If I could just add one part to that.
Sure.
He mentioned single payer, which various studies have were 30 to 40, $50 billion annual savings. But when I think it was General Motors was going through its bankruptcy, you know, one of the things they pointed out was they were paying more per car for healthcare costs than they were paying for steel in the car, steel and aluminum. And so they told Congress that they were considering moving all their plants in North America to Canada in order to take advantage of their single-payer system in Canada in order to reduce costs. If we had a single-payer system in the United States, which would significantly lower healthcare costs for most people, especially for businesses, you would see businesses flocking towards New York State. We got to create jobs in New York State. And I always remember when I was doing some phone calling for Howie, you know, one of the people that live in a rural conservative area said, one of the things I tell my rural conservative friends is that Howie Hawkins is the only candidate who has an actual jobs program. You know, our Green New Deal program is a full employment program. We would guarantee actually everybody a job. But if we moved to 100% clean energy by 2030, the estimate was we would create 5 million new jobs in New York State. Now, not all of them would be permanent jobs, but if you looked at what's called 40-year jobs, it's still about 300,000. People are leaving New York State because they can't find work, especially in upstate New York. So we got to put people back to work, and we got to lower the cost of business, and that particularly means lowering the property tax cap, property taxes, not doing bumper slogans that Cuomo does that doesn't actually accomplish anything.
Let me follow up because you use the term and it's used commonly and it's ill-defined. First, what do you mean by rich? What is the actual dollar value of income that would define as rich that you're looking to target to raise taxes on? The second thing that you've mentioned is that the single-payer health care, often called Medicare for All, has been, several estimates have been done on this. It's looking to double the New York State budget by, it would be $180 million, which would effectively increase taxes for everyone in New York State by threefold. So can you please explain to me, I'm not following exactly how that would help.
Okay, the bracket right now is about $600,000 for a couple. That's where the millionaire's tax starts. I would just say, let's be honest in our advertising. Start at $1 million, but have more brackets graduating up above $1 million. And second part of your question was on, yes, more money would go through the public sector, but we'd save 45 or 50 billion dollars, it's billion, right?
Right.
$1 billion a year in what we pay now, because now we pay taxes for Medicare and Medicaid, and we also pay premiums, co-pays, deductibles, and out of pocket when we're not covered, which a lot of the crappy insurance you can buy doesn't cover a lot of stuff. So we're actually saving ourselves money. And I think the only people that should be opposed to that are those who dogmatically think anything that's public is bad. But I want to save money, so I'm for single payer.
I mean, we're already paying more money in the United States than all the other industrial countries pay, about twice as much per capita for healthcare. The difference is they cover everybody. We have in New York, nationwide, somewhere between 20 to 30 million without coverage, which increases bills for the rest of us when, you know, the hospitals and, you know, can't get their things covered. And all those countries have better health care than we do. So we have the most expensive hospitals, the most high-tech hospitals on the planet. We have at least as well-trained doctors and nurses and other medical professionals as any place else. We're spending twice as much money per capita than basically all the other countries. And yet we have a healthcare system that is ranked around 35th on the planet. That does not make sense. And I remember 20 years ago, speaking at a town hall meeting with my congressman, and he was raising similar concerns and said, listen, I'm a frugal guy. One thing I can say is that as a town board official, I manage to cut taxes every year. I don't know any other elected officials who can say that they cut taxes every year. So I don't like wasting money. But I said to the congressman, I don't really care whether I reach in my pocket with my wallet and I pull out the money, or I reach into my other pocket and pull the money. I'm concerned about how much money I'm pulling out. And if I can lower the amount of money that I'm pulling out to pay for this stuff, and it's less, then I support it.
Are you
Yeah,
in
yes, sir.
favor of pay cuts for doctors?
Go ahead.
Do you consider yourselves to be socialists? And if so, how would you move New York State toward a socialist economy? Why is that?
Well, I think we take it, program by program. Oh, the question is, we're campaigning as socialists. How would we take New York into a socialist economy? And I think we go with the things that people expect government to do, like most people believe that government should be the employer of last resort. If you want to work, we have a work ethic, and if you can't get a job in the private sector, you should be able to go to your employment office, not an unemployment office, and get a job providing community services or developing infrastructure that the community has defined it needs. That's the way the Works Progress Administration worked in the Great Depression, and we need to revive that concept now. And the same thing with people believe that, yes, the government should guarantee health care to everybody. It's a right that ought to be we consider as a right. And so these are the things that, as we move them forward, we begin to socialize the economy. Now, what we mean by socialism is economic democracy. Right now, we have the capitalist system concentrates wealth in a tiny handful, and that translates into concentrated political power. So we have the rich buying the best politicians that money can buy, and that's what we're seeing. I was just asked on a radio show, how are you going to beat Andrew Cuomo when he's got all this money? Well, one answer is people need to realize that we can't let our politicians be bought for us. We need to make up our own minds. So we're calling for economic democracy. What that means is in the public sector, when we have public enterprises, they should be democratic. We have public enterprises that are not democratic. Ask the tenants of NYCHA. They have nobody on the board of NYCHA, which has been neglected. They got mold, lead, the elevators don't work, the roofs are leaking, and the boilers aren't working. They're freezing in the wintertime. That's not a democratic public enterprise. If the tenants who are the people most affected elected a good portion of the board, we'd probably get a responsive New York City Housing Authority. And in the private sector, instead of businesses where you just get a wage and all the other value you create goes to the people that own it, we should have cooperatives where you receive income in proportion to the labor you contribute. You get the full fruit of your labor, and that will create a more equitable distribution of income in the first place, and the wages will come up. So those are the kind of programs we're developing, and it'll only go as far as the people want it to go, because we believe in a democratic socialism. So,
I mean, one thing I would add to that, Howie did outline previously our support for public ownership, democratic control of our energy system. And I was meeting with the gentleman with little title in the governor's office, he's the energy czar for New York State. And we were discussing why New York State has done horribly in terms of providing renewable energy. We have only 4% coming for electricity from solar and wind. And he was like, well, Mark, the real big problem, besides siting, which is a big issue, is that the transmission system. And it's so hard to get the utilities and everybody to agree on how we're going to do the transmission and distribution of electricity. And I said, well, if that's really your biggest barrier, why don't you just own it? Why don't you just take over the distribution system? It would save the taxpayers a lot of money because we're paying a huge profit now, and it would be coordinated, and that would solve your problem. And he sort of sputtered and didn't have any answer. Another thing to do on energy, maybe not quite socialism, we spend $1 billion on Solar City out in Buffalo. Well, their economic model was to give solar panels to everybody on their roofs for free, as long as it was, cost-benefit analysis. We'd have, 7-year payback. And so I said to him, why isn't New York doing that? Why doesn't New York just say, we're going to put panels on every single building where it is cost-effective, we'll give you 7-8 years to pay it off, and then you can discuss whether the state owns it or community groups owns it. But, we need to move along here, and, public ownership is one of the ways. And when I was talking with another top Cuomo staff person about, we can't cite large-scale renewables programs in New York State, which is one of the reasons we're moving so slowly. And I said, well, why don't you look at the European model? Like in Germany, it's not been the national government that's driven the transition to renewable. It's been local government, and it's mainly done by municipal power. And the thing is, when a municipal power system comes in and says we want to build a solar farm, the local residents see it more as a common good, and therefore they're less, feel they need to object. And if they do feel the need to object, they know they can go down to town hall, city hall at the next meeting, raise their hand and raise objections. So they have a way to interact where we allow the private sector to do it, they're in there for the thing. She said, yeah, it's brilliant. And did you know that in Europe, it's been the public pension funds that have financed the construction of offshore wind? I said, no, I did not know that. Good point. Can we get the governor on speakerphone? Let's get him on this conversation.
He's right here.
Well, yeah, one thought just on socialism and the Buffalo Billion and the Tesla factory. Okay.
Sorry.
You know, we gave $750 million to Tesla. And I'm not totally opposed to so-called picking winners, particularly in this energy transition. We've got to, you know, do what we can to get that sector going. But the thing I object to is that we just gave them the money. Any other investor, any good capitalist would say, I want my share of the earnings if this project works out. And we're not getting the earnings back. So if Tesla came to us for $750 million to build a zero emissions factory for vehicles and another one for solar panels, I would say give us an equity position. So if this works out, the public who took a risk gets earnings just like a private investor would. And that's public ownership, and people will cry socialism, but I say if it's good enough for the capitalists, it's good enough for the public.
Are you in favor of disinvestment, state pension fund in operations in Israel, companies in Israel, or would you keep that money flowing?
Repeat that question, please.
The question is, would we divest from companies in Israel from the state public pension fund? I do support boycott, divestment, sanctions until Israel starts respecting the human rights of Palestinians, and they're doing the exact opposite. I don't think we can give them the blank check that this country has been giving them. We can't be a neutral arbiter in any bargaining to get to a peace settlement when we're totally back in the Israeli side. I would do it in steps, not just divest it all at once, but I'd divest a piece of it and then see what Israel, how they respond, and then just keep the pressure on that way. So yeah, I'm for divestment over time.
We haven't had one from her yet.
Yes, just switching gears for a second. That we've talked with quite a few people that are concerned about the dairy industry in upstate New York. Farmers are just having a really hard time and it's not making money. And there have just been so many different, well, maybe this would work, or of like, you know, should we invest more in advertisements, like another Got Milk campaign, or should we, or is it, one dairy economist I talked to was like, it's supply and demand. Some dairy farmers just have to go out of business. But I was wondering if you had any ideas for how to give the dairy industry a boost and what those would be. I guess also NAFTA is playing a big question these days too.
Yeah, well, three things. One is, the question is, how do we help the dairy industry? And the dairy industry is really suffering. They haven't met their production costs for 4 years in a row. A lot of them are going out of business, and some of them have even committed suicide. It's like, you know, these farmers in India when the trade deals and they can't sell their crop and cover, you know, support their family. So first thing is we need to organize the market so we're not overproducing. Second thing is these big corporate farms, we need to scale them back because then it makes the family farming, they're the ones that are creating the oversupply.
Oh, like in other states, you would try to work with other states to...
Yeah, other states and Canada in the trade deal. And then the third thing is, as an emergency measure, we should do what we did in 2007. And the states should top up the income they made so they at least cover their cost of production for the last year as an emergency measure till we work out these other things. But, you know, I just want to say this, that the farming sector is so important to the future because of climate change. We're going to have rapid change in the environment. These farmers are going to have to adapt. They got to bring the carbon back into the soil. So I think we really need to provide public support for them. I know ideologically a lot of these guys say just leave me alone, but right now they're not going to make it if we just leave them alone. We need to be talking about real solutions so they can stay in business and actually more people can get into the industry. And in fact, I know for a fact that a lot of the Mexican and Central American labor on the dairy farms and in the, you know, the orchards and the fields, they want to get into farming here. They were farmers before NAFTA in Mexico and Latin America. They've been pushed off by the trade policies that undercut their ability to have access to land and to sell their crops at a price that would support them. they want to get back into farming. They're interested in cooperatives. I think we have future farmers there, is what I'm saying.
I just want to jump in a bit on that. For many years, I was executive director of the Hunger Action Network of New York State. And probably about 20, 25 years ago, we were probably the only consumer group, and certainly the only anti-hunger group in the country, that supported the Dairy Price Compact, which was an effort to give more money to farmers. And all these consumer and anti-hunger organizations called us up and said, how can you possibly do this? How can you possibly support increase in the price of, say, milk cartons in the school lunch program by 2, 3, 4 cents a carton? And I said, if we allow our farmers to go out of business here in America, the price of milk will be a whole lot more expensive because we won't have people producing the supply. And partly as a result, we've always had very good relationships both with the dairy farmers and the Farm Bureau in general. And that was very helpful 4 or 5 years ago when we were trying to convince Senator Gillibrand, who was on the Senate Agriculture Committee, to take a more progressive stance on the Farm Bill, particularly as related to hunger, which is actually the biggest part of the Farm Bill. Because we were able to get the Farm Bureau to sign a letter with us to Gillibrand that dealt with a wide range of issues, she switched. And she became the strongest person in America on the advocacy side. She already was doing a lot of good work on the dairy side, but the fact that the farmers trusted Hunger Action Network because we had stood with them in the past made a big difference, and that it was able to us work more with Senator Gillibrand.
Just speaking of which, you reminded me, would you support allowing whole milk in schools again? Some farmers have said that that would be because schools are such a big customer for them.
Sure, the question is, would we allow whole milk in schools again? And my answer is yes. I like whole milk. But, you know,
as we drive Howie around the state, he usually wants to drink milk. He doesn't want coffee, he doesn't want juice, he wants milk. In case any of our supporters are out there listening, have some milk for Howie.
Yeah, and...
is that true?
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. I don't know, people don't drink milk. I still drink milk.
When you're going to go vegan?
I got a lot of lactose intolerant family members, and so I get a lot of teasing about that, but they got to have milk in the fridge.
Howie, Stephanie Miner says she's been a big success in Syracuse. What do you think? Was she a success in Syracuse?
No. She imposed austerity budgets and advocated, along with the mainly Republican Mayor's Conference right after when she came into office, that we have to balance the city budget on the backs of municipal workers, and was advocating that we get rid of the Triborough Amendment. So she was for austerity. She gentrified downtown very deliberately, pushing the poor people out, the people of color, got rid of the senior center, moved the bus station to the edge, and subsidized high-end condos. And then she gave to core development, before she got in a beef with them, the right to develop the inner harbor. It's all upscale. So that increases segregation, and we're one of the most segregated cities in the country. So I would not say she had a good term in mayor. I was asked, I ran for mayor last year in Syracuse. I gave her a D. She was good on the social issues, and the city didn't go bankrupt. It's on the verge. So she had at least kept it from going bankrupt, but that's about all I can say.
Do you think the progressive agenda, as defined by Ralph Nader, has been considerably narrow? And I speak of this, many of the things that, ironically, Ralph Nader was advocating, reindustrialization of the country, NAFTA and GATT, seem to have been accomplished by President Trump. So isn't President Trump, in some sense of the word, a progressive populist in terms of accomplishment?
Work that into your answer.
I would not say that. I mean, anybody that, every political statement he makes is designed to divide the country between people who have white identity politics and every other ethnic group or immigrant in the country. There's nothing you can call progressive in that. And Trump's trade policies, and we were just talking about dairy farmers, I mean, he says nonsense about all the dairy products have to pay a 300% tariff. No, they don't. There's a quota system that was negotiated, and it's only one product, if it goes over quota, where they pay the 300% tariff. So everything he says, every time he opens his mouth, it's a lie. And there's nothing progressive about that. If you lie to the people, you're not serving the people.
But he did open up NAFTA. He did open that up.
Yeah, but what have we got from it? Not much. A little
not
tweaking on the autos that really hasn't been agreed to. I mean, he always announces the result before we got the result.
Okay.
You know?
Mr. Hawkins, I'm sorry. I know you have several other questions, but I just wanted to follow up. You mentioned that you're a socialist, so I'm wondering, what socialist nations have you lived in and how long? And which socialist nation are you emulating your fiscal and economic and general governmental policies on?
I wouldn't say we've had any socialist nations. We've had attempts at socialist revolutions, like the election of Allende in Chile, that attempted to do it by electoral means, and they were overthrown by CIA-backed coup, put in Pinochet, a fascist. I think the old Soviet Union was state capitalist. The party state elite was exploiting the workers, extracting the surplus for themselves, and then when the opportunity came to become, regular capitalists, they got together with the black market mafia and grabbed all the state assets for themselves. And now it's gangster capitalism. Venezuela had social programs. They didn't socialize the means of production. In other words, democratize them. Cuba isn't a democracy. There's no socialism without democracy. So there's no model. There are ideals that go back to the first workers' party in the world. When Karl Marx was 11 years old, we had a working men's party here in New York. In 1830, they elected somebody to the assembly, the president of the Carpenters Union. And their reaction to going from their artisanship, where they had their own tools, craftsmen, or from the farms to working in factories was, this is wages slavery. And they said that very consciously, looking at the slaves in the South. And they said, we need cooperative production, so we get the full fruit of our labor instead of the factory owner getting the surplus. And we need to manage our own work, and instead of being directed by a boss, which makes us dependent, not free men, which is the Republican ideal. The Jeffersonian kind of republicanism was, you own small property, therefore you're not dependent on anybody, then you can be a free citizen. The slaves said the same thing when the Reconstruction tried to impose, they called it free labor, but a wages system. Go back to work for the plantations for wages. And they said, we don't want wages slavery, we want a piece of land, 40 acres and a mule, so we can be independent, free people. So to me, the way to have freedom, if you're in a large-scale enterprise, is to have a share of the ownership, you get a reward in proportion to your labor, and you have a say in the management. If it's a large enterprise, maybe you elect the board. If it's a small enterprise, you have an assembly and make the basic management decisions. So that's my idea of socialism, and there's no model I'll point to. I think it's an ideal we haven't realized yet.
Is
Don't
Cuomo
you have to be in Ithaca?
Are we getting...
We're getting close to leaving.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, my parking meter ran out
Is
too.
Cuomo a crook? Does he belong in jail?
He should be investigated. We're running Michael Sussman, a real independent for Attorney General, who has the independence to investigate Cuomo as well as Trump. He is a lawyer with more litigation experience than all the Democrats and Republicans who have run put together in state court, federal court, on up to the Supreme Court. Landmark decisions like the Yonkers desegregation case, which was featured in Show Me a Hero miniseries on HBO. He's the lawyer in that miniseries, not himself, somebody depicting him. The civil service case for black and Latino workers against discrimination, got them $45 million settlement. Took on the case of DJ Henry, a black Pace University student, killed by a white cop. The DA wouldn't prosecute. He took it to a civil case and got $6 million for the family. And I'm just starting to lay out all the cases he's won. And he is independent. Tish James is now part of the Cuomo machine. Wofford is the Republican corporate lawyer. I think people ought to look at Michael Sussman. And he will investigate Trump. Trump and Cuomo. I'm not sure the others will.